now we can move on to the first sort of chunky piece of news from the month, and that is actually quite disappointing. It's some news coming from the old Oswestry site, and this is something that every now and then, especially Andy has been mentioning on Watching Brief in passing, and also we covered, I think, a year or two ago on the Watching Brief. It's been ongoing, rumbling on in the background of British archaeology for a while now, and just when I thought, because, and I might be wrong here, and maybe you can correct me on this, but I thought this had been put to bed. I thought that the Save Old Oswestry campaign were celebrating success not that long ago, very recently, but now it seems as though there's been a turnaround. Can you explain what's going on for us?
But very briefly,
Uh huh.
earlier on this year, before the coronavirus crisis broke,
Hmm.
Galliers Homes, which is the company which is seeking to build houses within the setting of the Old Oswestry Hill Fort, which is a nationally important site.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody acknowledges that, including Historic England.
Mm-hmm.
It's been referred to as the Stonehenge of the Iron Age. Um, there is
Why?
an
Why
ongoing
does everything have to be the
attempt to. There's been
Stonehenge of
an
something? That really bothers me. The Stonehenge of this, the Stonehenge of that. Oh, we found the Stonehenge of
it,
Peru. Like, can't sorry, go on.
it's an easy shorthand to show a non-specialist audience that something's really important. I would
Okay.
defend the use of the phrase.
Okay. Fair enough.
Um, anyway, cut to the chase. No, earlier on this year, Gallis Homes withdrew a double planning application to build houses within the setting of Old Oswestry on what's
Mm-hmm.
currently farmland
Mm-hmm.
between the town and the hill fort. Um, at that point, that's where the celebrations began, because this is a story that's been going for over 10 years, and the Save Old Oswestry campaign, which has fought tooth and nail to prevent this development as being inappropriate
Mm.
in the setting of such an important ancient site, um, for a moment thought that that was the end of it,
Right.
that the company was giving up. In fact, it turns out what had happened is that they've been in negotiation with Historic England, had a number of meetings on site, as well as obviously negotiations going on in the background,
Mm-hmm.
and the company came back with a new single planning application for slightly fewer houses, which Historic England have now published a letter saying that the new plan is an improvement on the old plans, and doesn't do substantial harm to the setting of the site. And that's what's made people very angry, because a lot of people on the Save Old Oswestry campaign were expecting Historic England to oppose the planning applications. They've opposed all the previous ones. In fact, what they've effectively done is greenlit it for the council.
Yeah. Which, which is a bit of, well, it's not a bit of a shame is an understatement in so much as it's yet another little pointer in the direction that uh, the, the 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 weight of consideration is likely to be towards development in this country, or in these countries that make up the United Kingdom uh, in the future. Uh, Historic England um, keep on trying to make the case that they are still very much uh, for heritage and making the case for heritage. But if a little tweak to this sort of plan can make such a difference to how they view it, one has to wonder who is in fact putting the case for heritage in these instances. And it's so, for example, we were recently asked in a comment uh, to if there were any follow-ups to the Battle of Bosworth Field situation, where at the same time eyebrows had been raised by the likes of you and me as to Historic England's role in that scenario, saying, "Oh, yeah, we're making comments about the economic viability of the plan, which is not remotely shouldn't be in their remit," and it's concerning. And I suppose what do you think this means if such a high profile campaign can be can be undermined at the last minute? Where does that leave? Where does that leave the role? No, sorry, the sanctity and the preservation of historic sites in the United Kingdom, in so much as Historic England weren't quite doing it, so this very high-profile public campaign did it. If that doesn't work, what will work? What is the future for this sort of activism?
I think we need to identify two immediate issues with Old Oswestry. One is processual, and the other one is more fundamental. And I'll start with the processual one. The Historic England letter came during a statutory consultation period for the new planning application.
Hmm.
Every planning application going forward has to have a public consultation where interested parties from any background can make representations to the council planners about whether they want to, whether they're for or against the plan, or neutral, or want to raise a particular technical issue, right?
Hmm.
That's absolutely legit. Uh, those consultations are based on information. And that includes responses from statutory advisors, which include Natural England and other bodies, but also in terms of heritage, Historic England within England. Obviously, this Cadw and Royal Commission in Scotland and the equivalent bodies in Northern Ireland have the same role in under their devolved planning systems.
Hmm.
So what happened here was what has actually fueled the row is that Historic England's advisory letter, which is a standard thing that they would produce for any planning application. The advisory letter was submitted only 3 working days, possibly 2 working days before the end of the consultation, when many of the consultees had already made their submissions.
Hmm.
So, and what the letter did was effectively change Historic England's position from one of opposition, which had been on the previous planning applications, to one of saying less than substantial harm and over to you, council, to make the decision. And most independent observers would expect the council to follow Historic England's guidance, accept there's less than substantial harm, and probably pass the planning application, grant consent. So there is anger that it came so late, and people weren't able to interrogate it in detail and try and refute it before the consultation ended. Because once the consultation ends, there are very few opportunities, particularly for opponents, to attempt to supply the planning committee with information. What happened? What people can always submit letters to the planning application and emails and so on afterwards, but they don't carry the same weight as the ones that as submitted during the consultation.
No.
And when it comes to the floor of the council, or whatever arrangements are made under COVID-19, and that's another question for another day. But there are very limited opportunities then for opponents to make representations to the planning committee. Usually the developer gets the largest and final say. So that's why people are cross about it. The more fundamental thing, the more fundamental question, and you're right to raise Bosworth, because it's a very similar issue of levels of harm to a irreplaceable national asset, basically, which is what these monuments are. The registered battlefields, Old Oswestry, it's a site of it's easily regarded as a site of the highest importance, and the precedent that is being set is that the settings of these sites can be nibbled away.
Yeah.
That's what Historic England have done by saying this. They're saying that if you've got a site of the highest national importance, but the level of harm is less than substantial, we won't oppose it. Now, they're not doing anything wrong there, and the people won't like me saying this, but they're not doing anything wrong there because that's their remit that they've been set by government. There's a misunderstanding among a lot of people who think Historic England is a conservation body. It's not. It's an arm's length organisation of government whose remit has been defined as supporting sustainable development and advising about heritage in that context.
And I suppose that's my problem, isn't it? In so much as, don't get me wrong, I wasn't. I know you weren't suggesting I was, but I'm not confused on that issue. But it does leave me wondering where um, in what, for example, I described in the interview with Mike Hayworth as an adversarial, essentially adversarial uh, setup. It follows on from government. It's in our courts, and it's also in the way that these sorts of scenarios are decided in this country. People have to make the case for whatever it is that they're defending. Uh, who is going to make adequate cases for these sorts of monuments moving forward, as it were? I don't particularly like that phrase, but in the future, who's going to make that case? Because if Historic England's remit is essentially to enable, sensitive or whatever development, be able to, helping developers to negotiate the pathways to getting their thing done. Um, who is the adversary to that point? And I don't mean that it's not, again, it's a very specific definition. It's not an aggressive thing. Uh, it's a battle of ideas. It's a philosophical thing. Who opposes this? Um, and to what extent should that other voice be listened to? In so much as one can see how it is that essentially a very well orchestrated social media campaign might not be seen as a particularly official voice, but it was a very loud voice. It was a very clear voice. And of course, when you get to the finish line on these scenarios, someone has to lose if they're in that sort of adversarial situation. But it just seems as though the weight of what's the word of the perception of historic England and their voice is so powerful and so strong and so important in these scenarios that when they comment on, for example, the economic viability of a project, or when they say, "Oh, this isn't significant damage," they completely undermine and obliterate the other side's argument. And I'm wondering if historic England can't be the voice protecting heritage that has to be taken seriously and really measured and weighed up and considered, then who will be that? Who can be that? And obviously, I don't, it's not like you can necessarily answer that question, but it makes me, I am concerned. I am concerned that heritage historic England's voice is so total on these matters. As you say, it essentially clears the way for the council now just to do what they're likely to do. Um, but I wonder whether, I mean, arguably, is this a question of naming? If you see what I mean, is the name Historic England a little bit deceptive? Is that why we keep on feeling let down by this body? Because actually, that's not their job anymore. If you see what I mean. I don't know. I'm sort of spitballing here, but any thoughts at all?
Yeah, I mean, this is a situation that's been developing for the last 10 years since
Hmm.
the restructuring under the coalition government, and the introduction of the National Planning Policy Framework, which in many respects for heritage was actually a good thing, because it actually um, defined heritage, first of all, as an important part of planning decision making.
Hmm.
But what's happened is that the nuances of the system as it's developed haven't been passed on to the public,
No.
the wider public. So and most of the time, it works out perfectly well, because we're not dealing with advice about sites which are of national importance, and there are compromises that can be made so that heritage can be taken into account.
Hmm.
Um, and the most obvious one is preservation by record of archaeology on development sites.
Hmm.
Um, you know, most of what is dug and preserved by record probably doesn't warrant preservation. But
No.
when you get a situation like this, and why this is, and Bosworth, and why Bosworth and Old Oswestry are important, is because the really big one that's coming down the road literally is Stonehenge,
And we're back to
and
Stonehenge.
Stonehenge World Heritage Site. Yeah. But these decisions, which compromise the integrity of nationally important sites,
Hmm.
uh, are obviously controversial, and in many cases, well, in fact, all the cases that we looked at, Bosworth, Old Oswestry, and at Stonehenge going forward,
Hmm.
there is a substantial part of the archaeological community which thinks that historic England is not taking an appropriate view,
Hmm.
that the pragmatic, technocratic view supporting the planning system is essentially wrong in terms of public good.
Mm.
and in terms of future generations. So we're seeing in all these cases in Bosworth, but particularly at Oswestry and at Stonehenge, substantial numbers of very well-regarded academic archaeologists who are turning around and saying to Historic England, "You cannot make this decision is just not appropriate."
Mm.
So what we're dealing with is an academic house divided over this,
Mm-hmm.
and a situation where the protester of last resort is now civic society
Mm.
and campaigns like Save Old Oswestry and the Stonehenge campaign and so on. And there are obvious dangers in that. First of all, ad hoc campaigns, however brilliantly they are run and however committed the individuals are that are taking part, don't have the same weight as government bodies.
No.
And they can't call on the same resources of as government bodies.
Mm-hmm.
And the particular issue is judicial review,
Yeah.
which is one of the few weapons that people who oppose a planning decision have got. It's asking a judge to decide whether the planning application was appropriately done under law.
Mm.
But that is very expensive and very risky because if you lose, you have to pay the other side's costs.
Exactly. Yeah.
And
I, I,
there,
I'm.
there's a list of many cases where cases that should have gone to judicial review objectively because they were setting important precedents. For example, the sale of material for museums like Second Car
Mhm.
um, didn't go to judicial review because the people organising the campaigns weren't able to take the risk.
Precisely. Precisely. And again, I come back to the question of who will speak then. It almost sounds like something from Lord of the Rings. Who will speak for the for the antiquarian
Well,
or the antiques?
can I finish with a very smart piece of drafting in Historic England's statement
Hmm.
that they've
Hmm.
issued to accompany their advisory letter.
Hmm.
And having said that, they've tried to work with all sides to reach a satisfactory achievement, a satisfactory solution over more than 10 years and so on. They conclude by saying, we have advised the council that the proposals will cause some harm. Right?
Hmm. Hmm.
It's now for the council as decision maker in the planning process to weigh this harm against the potential public benefits of the proposal.
Mm.
Now, what that's doing is saying, not our problem, Gov, over to you.
Yeah. Which
As the elected body, which is, in terms of local democracy, elected councils making the decision is how it should be.
Yeah, but also
But
an awful lot of people are very suspicious of local councils, and there's also the talk of backhanders, and not in this case, but in local cases I've seen, people get. It is not an answer, and also, uh, it. You see, I understand that it fits in with a political philosophy. Small governments, conservatives love the idea of local, giving power back to people, essentially, actually not taking any responsibility for anything
localism.
on regional levels. But I'm reminded, and I'm sure this isn't the first time I've mentioned this in these videos, but it's been a while, I think, since I have mentioned this. I'm reminded of Dungeons and Dragons, and there's a deity in the
You mean it goes on forever and is a complete waste of time?
no, 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 no. There's a deity in the Forgotten Realms called Helm, who is called the Watcher, and essentially, this deity is someone who takes a particularly long view on things. Sometimes can appear to be cold and distant and disinterested, when actually. He is concerned primarily with the long good, the benefit that will come out of often inaction now or simply observing in the moment and keeping a status quo for the benefit of what mortals cannot see yet. And
Yeah.
that kind of feels like that's the role. And incidentally, I'm hoping some people appreciate that reference. Um, that's the kind of role that I feel as though a body called Historic England should be doing. I think they should, they shouldn't. Again, it's all in the name, but but uh, especially considering that they not that long, well, quite a while ago now, were attached to English heritage, who spend their time looking after various landscapes and buildings across the country, um,
Including Old Oswestry.
including, oh, well, there you go. Um, given that they weren't that long ago wedded to an organisation that is looking after this site in question, there you go, absolutely. Um, One would hope that their view would be a long view, and it would be a case of, well, actually, okay, at the moment, it may well be tempting to build houses just here, but will our great 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 grandchildren thank us for this? Um, and again, in the case of Old Oswestry, it's one of those things where um, I'm not trying to say it shouldn't happen. I suppose what I'm trying to say is that this is not a great signpost for future cases like this. The fact that Historic England keep on coming down seemingly on either the side of developers, or worse still in this case, as you've just suggested, essentially washing their hands and saying, well, some damage will be done, but it's down for, it's local councillors, it's not us. That isn't that's not that hasn't got that sense of responsibility that the organisation I feel should have. But the thing is, in practice, that's not what the organisation is about. And then I suppose we come back to this question of who will take on that role, who can take on that role effectively. And I suppose at the risk of us having another cycle of that conversation, I suppose we should bring it to a close. But I mean, what just do you want to respond to that then? That thought that there should be a helm-like body, as it were, um, who takes a long view.
Uh, that's clearly what campaigners in these situations want.
Yeah.
And I report this stuff. I'm not taking sides at the moment.
Hmm.
Certainly not in a conversation as short as this one has to be.
No.
It's a very complex area. But I certainly think that Historic England is in danger of being completely out of step with the wider academic archaeological community, and what is potentially worse, with the public. Because if archaeologists lose the public, when we say we're doing a public good, then we've got a problem as a sector as a whole.
Yeah.
And just one last thing to flag up, which broke last night after we did the prep for this.
Hmm.
It has become apparent that the government has postponed the decision on a number of road schemes, including the Stonehenge Tunnel,
Oh, really?
to the middle of July.
Right.
And very tellingly, the parliamentary statement, where a written statement which said this, because the statement was originally meant to was meant to be imminent.
Hmm.
The Department for Transport said that they're deferring the decision until the middle of July on these schemes because they require further work. Now, there is a suspicion that further work is because of the appeal court, the Supreme Court, I think it was, in fact, which found that the government had breached environmental requirements over the Heathrow runway application. It was pretty humiliating that the Heathrow third runway proposal was knocked back because the Department for Transport didn't consider the importance of some 2016 environmental agreements that the government had undertaken. It may well, a lot of specialists think that these road schemes similarly don't take into account those environmental requirements, which
Right.
is, and if they had come to judicial review, a judge would probably knock them back.
Which also, incidentally, just I suppose just one thing as well that I've noticed. Some people have been around this story have been talking about how, and I really hope that this sort of conversation will disappear now that we have left Europe. But people have been saying, oh, it's all European money's fault, making the argument that apparently being in the EU has led to development being prioritised. But as you just pointed out, these environmental stipulations are essentially tied to European polluter pays standards, etc. So,
Absolutely.
so
And
that
yeah,
need was it just that needs to be, that needs to be forgotten, because you can't keep on blaming the European Union, mate. Kind of thing. As much as we happen to be living in a country which is very pro-developer, that's not the EU's fault. So I just wanted to mention that.
no, absolutely. Fundamentally, although European environmental law does impose the polluter pays principle and other stipulations, the execution of and application of those principles is down to national governments. And since 2010, we have had a particularly pro-developer government.
Yeah, precisely.